So in 3 seconds.
Would you like me? All right. Oh my God, oh my God. Verily, these servants are turning to thee, supplicating thy kingdom of mercy. Verily, they are attracted by thy holiness and set aglow with the fire of thy love, seeking confirmation from thy wondrous kingdom and hoping for attainment in thy heavenly realm. Verily, they long for the descent of thy bestowal, desiring illumination from the sun of reality. O Lord, make them radiant lamps, merciful signs, fruitful trees and shining stars. May they come forth in thy service and be connected with thee by the bonds and ties of thy love, longing for the lights of thy favor. O Lord, make them signs of guidance, standards of thine immortal kingdom, waves of the sea of thy mercy, mirrors of the light of thy majesty. Verily, thou art the generous. Verily, thou art the merciful. Verily, thou art the precious, the beloved.
You heard Sue Emmel, some of you heard Sue Emmel say, we have known John since John was a teenager. Literally known John since he was a kid. Also had the honor of knowing John's parents because John lived in Wilmette and there were times when we used to hang around at his parents' house. By the way, the Cubs are doing really well. Your dad would be very pleased. Additionally, Jerry Woodall, who's here in this thing, Jerry and Ivor and I went homefront pioneering to Northfield Township. So I've really been very close to these two brothers. But John has moved away from Wilmette and has achieved wonderful and great things. And I want to tell you some of the things that Dr. John Woodall has achieved. He is a board-certified psychiatrist and the founder of Unity Project, a resilience learning system that was developed to promote strength in youth. He coordinated the resilient response to social crisis working group at Harvard's Interfaculty Initiative. He was the coordinator of the Task Force on Accountability on War Crimes in the former Yugoslavia through Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Woodall has lectured, consulted, and developed programs on resilient responses to crisis, human rights, conflict resolution, and inter-ethnic dialogue across the US, in Central America, Canada, the Balkans, Cyprus, Israel, and the Palestinian territories for universities, the US Department of State, the United Nations, and non-governmental organizations. Dr. Woodall also lectures and provides consultation to schools and corporations on building united and resilient communities. John had asked me not to read a huge bio, but I can't help myself. So with that being said, here's John Woodall.
Well, everyone, it's so good. I'm not able to see everyone. Is there a view that we could do to allow me to see everybody, or is how are we set up here? Is that possible, G?
Nabil's a tech.
Yes. What? Sorry, can you repeat the question?
He wants to.
Is it possible to see everybody's face, or is that going to be too hard?
You should be able to if you go into the gallery view.
Okay. All right. You know what? I'm just going to stop being a problem and just get started. I apologize for starting late. It really is entirely my fault. Can you still hear me if I close? Okay, good. I just had some technical problems with the Zoom link, but it really is a great pleasure for me to be here with you. It's been a very long day. I started with my first patient at 6:30 this morning, and I finished about an hour ago. So these are my days. So I bring my weary body and mind to you tonight, but it's a great joy, and I know I'm going to draw strength from our being together. So thank you all for being here tonight. The topic is one of gravity. How do we present ourselves to the world in a way that is authentic and that is noble and is worth, it makes life worth living in the face of the kind of chaos and pain and suffering that's in the world today. Many of you know that my office is in Newtown, Connecticut, where the horrific school shooting happened just a little over 10 years ago. So on a daily basis, I'm working with young people, people of every age really, who are trying to find their way still in a world that such a horrific event is possible. How do you find meaning in a world that something like this can happen, where a child can not only be taken from you, but be taken in such a horrific way? This cuts to the very core of one's sense of hope, one's sense of purpose in life, one's sense of a belief that there should be fairness or good in the world. So how do we then approach life in a way that feels, well, worth living even? So Ajit, you'll tell me if there's any problem with my sound, okay? So what I see every day in the context of my clinic, I see it as a microcosm of what all of us are going through one way or another. All you have to do is open up your computer or your phone or the television, and it doesn't take more than a couple seconds before we're flooded with all manner of crises, all manner of suffering, things that are designed to make us angry, to make us afraid, to make us dislike someone. And indeed, there's a lot of bad going on in the world right now. I had just yesterday a young woman in my office who her mother had brought her to me because she just had no motivation. She has no sense of desire to be doing much of anything. It felt like she was just sort of drifting. And when her mother was asking her about this a few days ago, she said that she wanted to die. And she didn't say it with any great depression or sense of anguish. She said it in a kind of matter-of-fact way because she was in that school when the tragedy happened 10 years ago. Just out of college, or just out of high school now, but a couple years older than the kids who were killed. And so she grew up in a context in which there was no safety in her world, or she didn't have a sense that the world can provide safety. So now at the ripe old age of 18, she's wondering if what life is worth living and whether it just would be better off to leave. So imagine that being the state of affairs when you're only 18 years old. So what happened in my office just the other day with this young woman is going on in the minds of kids all over certainly all over the country, this country, and in every country of the world right now. The generation that we're raising now, whether it's violence, whether it's immigration, whether it's environmental catastrophe, whether it's political upheaval, war, they're wondering what it is that life has to offer them. So in my work as a psychiatrist and in my work in human rights efforts and some of the resilience work we did, it was always under the context of language and backgrounds that weren't explicitly focused on the spiritual nature of a human being, that were more focused on psychological insights and as valid as they are, but without really talking directly about our spiritual nature. And one of the reasons I was so grateful to be asked by Ajit to speak with you tonight was because it under this this shelter of the Baha'i context and of our meeting in a Baha'i Fireside, we have license to talk about spiritual matters, which is something I really wanted to talk about, because it really is at the root of what we would describe as resilience. And I thought I would begin with a couple stories, and then elaborate on why these are important stories as we go along. For most of you, I imagine there's several Baha'is on the call, and they'll know these stories, but there are some people who are just becoming familiar with the Baha'i teachings and the Baha'i community, so the stories might be new to you. But I thought I would just start with two stories in particular. The first one has to do with the visit of the son of Baha'u'llah to the United States in 1912. Baha'u'llah is the founder of the Baha'i faith. His name means the glory of God, Baha'u'llah. The glory of God. A Baha'i is a follower of Baha'u'llah in the same way that a Christian, the IAN, indicates a follower of Christ. A Baha'i is a follower of Baha, or a follower of the glory of God. So without going into the whole dramatic and tremendously exciting story of Baha'u'llah's life, we're going to talk about Baha'u'llah's son. It turned out that Baha'u'llah was, who lived in the 1800s, he was born in 1870, passed in 1892, in that time frame, was profoundly persecuted in the land of his birth, which was Iran, and exiled over the course of his lifetime to more and more stringent confinement and more cruel exiles. And the interesting thing was, everywhere they sent him, the people who were intended to imprison him would become either his followers, or they would become so intimidated by the influence that this prisoner had that they would send him somewhere else. So during this time, his eldest son, who is known to history as Abdul Baha, which means the servant of Baha'u'llah.
John, I think we lost your audio.
All again, we lost your audio. Okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Start, keep going. Yeah, for a minute we did. That's okay.
Still can't hear him though.
You were talking about Abdul Baha's visit to America.
But Ajit, we still can't hear him.
You can hear him? Okay,
Cannot.
nobody else can hear you. Turn your volume up. I can hear you through my cell phone. Audience.
They're not here.
No. Huh?
So John, I texted you a number that you can call into the meeting with. Can you try that?
Nabil, did you give him your number?
He has my number, but I texted him the phone number to call in with his phone.
Okay.
I think that's him.
I'm okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you, how about now?
Yes. Much better.
Okay. Okay. All right. So here I'm talking about all these difficulties that Abdul Baha went through. And so I guess we're mirroring in technological terms that problem. This is entirely my fault. For some reason, my Zoom link isn't working. So thank you, Nabil, for being so patient with me and for finding these workarounds. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Okay. All right, great, thanks. Well, let's get back to the story I wanted to tell you about Abdul Baha. Just as a little background again. So during all of these horrific trials that his father was enduring as a result of his teachings, Abdul Baha was becoming known in these prison settings as this extraordinary human being who was not only wise beyond anyone's comprehension, but he was lovingly kind, and he was a constant servant of others. So his reputation became, really at the time in the early 1900s, became worldwide. And so in 1912, he came to this country. And in preparation for that, there was a relatively small Baha'i community at that time, but there was quite a stir in the country about his coming. And he had asked a woman by the name of Lua Getzinger if she wouldn't mind making arrangements for his travel. And so, and one part of the arrangement was to arrange for his coming to Chicago. So she asked a friend of hers, a woman by the name of Grace Robarts Ober, to come with her and to help set up preparations for Abdul Baha's visit to Chicago. Once he came from the East Coast, he would land from the Holy Land in England. He would come to America through the New York City. Grace and Lua Getzinger made their way to Chicago, and they prepared everything for Abdul Baha. And long story short, he winds up coming to Chicago to phenomenal fanfare and many amazing stories. And at the end of that visit, he was preparing to go out west when he asked Lua if she would go back to New York to finish or to prepare for his return there when he had finished going to the West Coast. And so Grace then went to Abdul Baha and said, oh, it would be such an honor if I could go with Lua to help prepare arrangements for you in New York City. And he stopped, Abdul Baha stopped, and he looked at her and he said, you want to serve me? And she said, oh, with all my heart, I want to serve you. And he shook his head, didn't say a word, but turned around and walked away from her. The next morning, the exact same scene unfolded, where she came to Abdul Baha and said, more than anything in the world, I want to serve you, and I want to go to New York with Lua and see if I can make arrangements for your return there. And Abdul Baha looked at her again and he said, you want to serve me? And she said, oh, with all my heart, if only I could, please allow me this privilege. And he turned from her and walked away, didn't answer. The third morning, it was the day that he was to leave for the West Coast. She again came to him and said, "Oh, more than anything, I would love to serve you. If you just allow me to go to New York and work with Lua to prepare for your return." And he looked at her, and now he said very sternly to her, he said, "You want to serve me?" And she said, "Yes, with all my heart." And then he turned from her and walked away. He didn't really answer her. So Grace went with Lua to New York and made all the preparations. And over the course of time, Abdu'l-Baha returned. And there was a big greeting of him in the city, and Lua and Grace were at this wonderful home to receive him. And a big crowd started to come through the door, that had been attending Abdu'l-Baha after his welcome to the city. And then Abdu'l-Baha himself came through the door, and people were weeping and grateful to see him. Then Abdu'l-Baha came right up to Lua Getzinger and embraced her and thanked her. And he looked right through Grace, didn't acknowledge her like he'd never met her before, like he didn't know her, and walked right by her. And she was stunned. She didn't know what to think. Maybe I wasn't supposed to come. Maybe I misunderstood, and maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm being punished. She was confused. So, but what she did do is that she said she worked harder than she had ever worked in her whole life. Scrubbing pots and pans, scrubbing floors, picking up after people, making arrangements for people to go to different places, working long after midnight, every single night, exhausted. And as soon as she would sit down to get some rest, word would come from Lua, from the master, from Abdu'l-Baha, of some other task she was supposed to perform. So then, just when she was catching her breath, wiping her brow, Lua would come with these new instructions, and then she would run off and take care of some other project. And this went on for weeks. And finally, towards the end of the visit in New York, there was arrangement for this new technology, a movie to be made of Abdu'l-Baha, just a video basically. But it was one of the old moving cameras that they had to crank. So this was a big deal because nobody ever had anything like that done. But there was going to be a movie made of the retinue with Abdu'l-Baha. So everyone went off to Brooklyn. To this whole huge entourage went off to Brooklyn to a man named Howard Bignut's home to have this video made or movie made. But the word came from Lua to Grace that Abdu'l-Baha was asking her to stay behind because there were two women who were expected to come to the house, and he wanted them to be received graciously, and so he asked her to stay. And so everyone went off to get in this movie with Abdu'l-Baha, and Grace is left behind. So she's just crestfallen that, what is going on here? Why is this happening to me? So she thought, well, at least maybe I can put these roses that just arrived, I can put them in Abdu'l-Baha's room because his door was always open and welcome to everyone. So she walked up the stairs to his room, but the door was locked, and it was never locked. He welcomed everyone. But this was the last straw. When she tried to get into the door, and there was, she just crumbled to the ground and began to cry. That she just didn't know what she'd done. Why was this happening to her? So later, the crowd came back from Brooklyn, and Lua was with the group and saw Grace and came up to her as soon as she entered the door, and Lua said to Grace, "Master wanted me to tell you that he knows that you wept." And when she heard this, she thought, well, then maybe there's a reason for all of this. Maybe there's some wisdom, some divine wisdom about why I'm being put through all this when everyone else is being received with such loving kindness, and their life their most cherished desires are being met by Abdul Baha, and maybe there's some sort of meaning behind all this. So she decided to make something to eat, and so she went into the kitchen, and there was no food there, and so there was like an egg and a piece of bread, but it was this bread that had been made by one of the followers of Abdul Baha and specially made for him. And so there was a slice of that bread and one egg. So she cooked the egg and put it in a little egg cup and started to tap it to break it open to eat it. And it was rotten beyond all compare. She says it was as rotten as an egg could get, and it exploded when she tapped it all over her. And so she cleans up, and then she has this one piece of bread, and she starts to tear at it and eat morsels of it. And then she started to think, this is the bread of life that's intended for Abdul Baha, that he gives to the world. She said she fell into this prayerful state. And as she began to fall into this prayerful state, she went to her room and began to think about what possible meaning could all of these struggles have had, and why was she going through all this? And it occurred to her that it wasn't that what she said that she began to pray in her room, and the spirit of prayer came over her, and she heard a voice, and the voice said, "Can you be as happy scrubbing the pans as you can be arranging the flowers?" And when she heard that, she had a sense come over her that it wasn't the tasks that counted. It was the heart that you brought to the tasks and the selfless desire for loving service. That's what counted. And a great peace came over her at that moment. And when that happened, the door opened in her room, and there was Abdul Baha, she said, in a state of glory. I would like to know what that meant, but that's the word she used. And he came into the room and he said, welcome to the kingdom. And then he came and embraced her. So somehow he knew that she had this transformation. And as soon as she had it, he was there. Now, how interesting is that? There are so many stories like this of Abdul Baha. I wanted to tell that story to put in context the spiritual challenge we all have, which is this world grinds us. It is one exploding egg after another, and much worse. And it's scrubbing pots and pans of perhaps ungrateful people who don't have our best interest at heart. And so the question becomes, what is the heart that we can have in a world like that, where it doesn't matter, where it's okay, that sense of peace and serenity that Abdul Baha called the kingdom, that is the point. How can we achieve that? And how can we see in our struggles an invitation to that? So at this level, in a very literal way, Grace literally was brought into the presence of the master the instant she came to that realization. And I can't help but think that story and stories like it, the countless stories like that of Abdul Baha, are meant for us now at this horrible time in history when there is so much division, so much confusion, so much alienation, so much estrangement, so much of a sense of isolation, that our suffering leads us to this crippling sense of isolation and meaninglessness. So how do we then reach this state of the kingdom? Now, I was brought up a Catholic. My brother and I, he's on the phone, we were brought up Catholic, and the kingdom of God was some kind of a place that there was a guy on a throne, a God on a throne. So some kind of a place. But in this story, the way Abdu'l-Baha uses the phrase, it's not a belief, it's not a theology, it's not a place. It was an inner condition. And it was an inner condition arrived at through prayer and sincerity and love and a willingness to let go of expectations about what the world is and what the world has in store for us, and what something good is, right? That it's so that we could see arranging the roses is just as meaningful as scrubbing the pots and pans, and vice versa. Scrubbing the pots and pans is just as wonderful as arranging the roses if our hearts are in the right place. So there, that's one story. Now I wanted to give you a second story, also about Abdu'l-Baha, also in New York, also at the same time. There was a Unitarian minister by the name of Howard Colby Ives, who wrote a book called Portals to Freedom. I really recommend this book to you if you can find it. I think it may be out of print, but it's the story. It's Howard Colby Ives's recollection of times he had with Abdu'l-Baha when Abdu'l-Baha was in this country. There are a couple of stories in there that are just so amazingly wonderful. But I guess I said I only had one more story, but I lied. I have two more stories, and they're of Howard Colby Ives. The first one is when Howard Colby Ives, a Unitarian minister, first heard of Abdu'l-Baha. He, as a minister, felt like a complete failure. He felt like his faith had died. He felt like everything he was espousing, he didn't practice, and he didn't see anybody else practicing it particularly. It sounded like a lot of dry theology and not a living experience. And so he was really in a kind of existential crisis, feeling like maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I shouldn't be a minister. Maybe there's no God. Maybe this whole spiritual enterprise is some kind of a delusion, or maybe I'm just not cut out for it. Maybe it's for someone else. So with that, he met some Baha'is who gave him some of Abdu'l-Baha's writings and Baha'u'llah's writings. And one word kept standing out to him in these writings. It was the word renunciation. It kept coming up in these writings, and he thought, what does this mean, renunciation? And he really wanted to know. He thought that somehow this capacity to renounce self was the answer, but he didn't understand how it could be and what it would feel like, what would be, how would we know we were in a state of renunciation? And is it even a good thing? So he really, more than anything, once he heard Abdu'l-Baha had come to this country, he wanted to meet Abdu'l-Baha, and he had a secret prayer that he actually shared with a friend, that he said, more than anything, I would love to spend some time with him alone and know what this means, this idea of renunciation. So, and then that was the end of that conversation. Well, sometime later, when Abdu'l-Baha had come back to New York City, this friend invited him to the home where Abdu'l-Baha was staying, and they went. But he was feeling separate from this whole big crowd was there at the home, wanting time with Abdu'l-Baha, and some people wanted their picture taken with him as kind of paparazzi kind of thing, and other people were, wanted their deepest questions answered or healing, all kinds of things. And he just was in his own self wrapped up in this dilemma of this, to him, a life or death struggle about meaning, and how do I find that spiritual spark that can make my life worth living again. And so he came into the house with his friend, but he immediately pulled himself away from the crowd and didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to be with anyone, but was wrapped in this question about how do I find a path again to a deeper meaning in life and to the answer to my spiritual questions. And just as he was kind of at this critical moment of thinking that maybe it's all lost, just at that moment, a door opened, and a big crowd of people that were just, glued on looking at Abdu'l-Baha came out of the room, and Abdul-Baha came out of the room. And as he did, crowd pressed up against him, and he motioned them aside, and he looked right at Howard Colby eyes, and he said it was the most penetrating, loving glance he'd ever seen. And he just felt, he wrote in the book, he said, he saw me. And then he wrote it again, he saw me. And in the book, it's capital SAW, bold and underlined. So he said it twice. So he felt something gripped him. What is the word he said? He said there was a sense of verity, truth, of ultimate truth, that he had been kind of ushered into something that was manifestly true, although it was beyond words. So Abdul-Baha motioned for him to come with him. And again, people pressing up against him. Abdul-Baha put his arm around Howard Colby Ives, and then with the other hand, he just motioned for people to leave them alone. And Abdul-Baha walked with Howard Colby Ives into this room. So now he's alone with Abdul-Baha, something he always wanted to be. So Abdul-Baha spoke a little bit of English, and they sat down, and they were kind of knee to knee in this room next to the window, and they barely spoke a word to each other. But Abdul-Baha looked at him with such loving kindness. Howard Colby Ives broke into tears because he felt for the first time there was a loving glance at him, a loving view of him that looked past all of his faults, all of his worries, all of his cares, all of his many failings, and just enveloped him in this compassionate, loving, fatherly gaze. And so he just sort of collapsed into Abdul-Baha's arms. And the point being, he was seen. So there's something about transformation that I wanted to talk about, in that how in our pain, we are often made alone. That how do we share with others our suffering, the pain that we've been through? We don't want to be, talking about these struggles all the time with people, or be known that way, or we don't want to burden our loved ones. But the reality is that winds up putting us in a place of isolation, and it underscores the precious event of being with someone who is present enough and in that kingdom of God that we were just talking about, that Grace Obert was in, Robarts Obert, that inner sense of assurance that when this person looks at you, you feel seen. And your life becomes worth something. In your life, the value of your life becomes recognized. A wonderful quote of Baha'u'llah's where he says, regard man as a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. So having those gems seen, maybe someone's seeing them when you don't even see them. That is one of the things that makes life worth meaning. With living. Perhaps it's the most important thing for us. Now, one more story. Abdul-Baha again, and it's also with Howard Colby Ives. So a burning question Howard Colby Ives had was, why pray? Why should we have to ask God for things? And what's the point? And shouldn't God just handle stuff for us? And why do we have to be in this beseeching, servile position? And so he had this question about, and here he's a minister, he's a Unitarian minister, and he has this question. And on another day in the same home, in the same room, Abdul-Baha, with the crowd outside, the door opened, and Abdul-Baha again motioned for Howard Colby Ives to join him in the room. And he did. And he asked Abdul-Baha, he didn't ask Abdul-Baha how to pray. But what Abdul-Baha did is he knelt down, and Howard Kolbias could see that he was wrapped in prayer, and his face became illumined. Abdul-Baha's face became illumined, and it looked as if his entire being was caught up in this sort of ecstasy. And Howard Kolbias says, well, I guess I'm supposed to pray. So he knelt down too, and he was, doing his kind of recitations of things that he was used to. And it was like, nothing was happening. And he'd open his eyes, and Abdul-Baha would still be in this reverie. And he thought, well, okay, now my knees are hurting. And so he would keep reciting things to himself, and nothing was happening. And he'd open an eye, and then Abdul-Baha would still be in this reverie. And he thought, what am I doing wrong here? How do I approach this? What do I do? And with that question, things just sort of lifted from him, and he felt himself guided to ask Abdul-Baha what to do. And Abdul-Baha opened his eyes and said, imagine yourself, see yourself in the presence of the Almighty. And then Howard Kolbias began to take that to heart, and he said, then what happened is he felt pulled into this divine presence where nothing else mattered, where time left him and his concerns left him, and all that was important was that he was in the presence of the life giver, the Lord of all things. And he says he has no idea how much time he and Abdul-Baha were on their knees, but after some time, they both opened their eyes, and Abdul-Baha got up, gave him a big hug, and they left the room. The point of that is that our spiritual life is not a belief. It has beliefs, and beliefs are helpful. They help us organize our thinking, help us with our values, help us with our important decisions, give us context for many of the crises in our lives. But what is essential for our spiritual growth is being able to go to that place before the giver of life, to have that power move within us and to get out of the way to allow it to move through us, as Grace Robards Ober learned in sacrifice for others. So I wanted to talk about one more concept, and then maybe we can have a conversation. And that's this idea about the idea of assurance. Abdul-Baha wrote a series of what we Baha'is call tablets, what he called tablets, which is a way to designate that these are sacred, these are highly important documents. Abdul-Baha wrote these tablets called the Tablets of the Divine Plan. And it's a remarkable set of documents written to the Baha'is of Canada and the United States, different regions of the United States and Canada, explaining how the world could be transformed into a spiritual rose garden, right? What the principles are for that to happen. It's astounding, written right in the depths of the worst war in history up to that time, right in the middle of the First World War. And in this, one of these tablets that Abdul-Baha wrote to the northeastern states, 3 times he mentions the phrase assurance. Uh-oh. Someone's calling me. So send a voicemail. Someone was just calling me. Oh, can you still hear me? I'm assuming everyone can still hear me.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
we're-
good. All right, sorry. So in this tablet to the northeastern states, Abdul-Baha says, every region of the world has special distinction. There's something that makes special every place in the world. That's why people go to Italy to have the great food, or to Istanbul to see the amazing the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque, or whatever it might be. So Abdul-Baha says, but these northeastern states have a special distinction, and that is they are distinguished in faith and assurance. Faith and assurance. He doesn't quite explain exactly what he means by those two words, but I'm going to speculate a little bit and then put it in the context of this idea of transformation. So Abdu'l-Baha had this habit of looking at someone who no one would see any quality in. And Abdu'l-Baha would see like a lion of courage or someone of profound spiritual loving capacity. And he would say, well, I'm giving you a new name. And it's, you know, you are now let's say in Arabic, the Habibi, your name is something that denotes this great spiritual power. So when Abdu'l-Baha says the New England states, or the Northeastern states, are distinguished by faith and assurance, to me that says, well, not yet. Well, that's a potential we have. That is one of these gems that we can aspire to. But what does it mean, faith and assurance? And I think it has to do with the experience of Grace Robarts Ober and Howard Colby Ives. That sense, you remember when Abdu'l-Baha burst into the room to say, welcome to the kingdom, when Grace had come to that sense that it doesn't matter what's going on outside, it's this enkindled heart that is free of the burden of self, that just wants to be in that light serving others, that and that where nothing perturbs that sense, that's what assurance is. So this state of assurance requires cultivation. It doesn't happen out of my experience. And maybe that's just me, because I'm probably as spiritually competent as I am in operating Zoom. So so faith would be like what you believe, and you're having faith that something will work out. But assurance is knowing that being in that place where there is nothing that could perturb you. Now, two final stories, and then we'll open this up. And the purpose of this was mostly just to give examples of where we might be looking when we're thinking about spiritual transformation in the time that we're in. One is the story of Haji Akund. There were a group of followers of Baha'u'llah in his lifetime, and also in the lifetime of Abdu'l-Baha, who were given these special distinctions. And the names they were given were, or the title was called a hand of the cause, a hand of the cause of God. Haji Akund was a hand of the cause of God, also one of the apostles of Baha'u'llah. Now, this man was really quite amazing. He was so well known as a Baha'i in Iran, that Persia at the time, that every time there was some kind of a problem in the community, in the wider community, the mullahs or the clergy or the ministers of the government would need a scapegoat, and the Baha'is were always the scapegoat. So that was just easy to blame them, because they didn't fight back. They're pacifists in that sense. So every time there was a problem in the community, Haji Akund would get dressed up in his finest clothes, because he knew he was going to be arrested and beaten and imprisoned. So at one of these times in Tehran, there was some crisis, and he knew he was going to be arrested, so he dressed up in his finest clothes. And sure enough, the police and the mullahs came for him, and they, marched him through the streets, and people threw things at him, and they brought him to the worst prison of the Persian Empire, the Siachal, the same prison that Baha'u'llah had been in. And they brought him in there, and the Shah's torturers, not the suburban country torturers, the Shah's torturers led into him for days. And the relatives lives not too far from here. And the story in the family is that they would be beating him and torturing him, and then the torturers would get tired. And then at that moment, he would look up and say, okay, guys, I'm ready. Anytime you want to start. He was mocking these people who were torturing him. So it got to the point where after days of this, they wrote to the Shah. They sent a message up to the Shah, and they said, "You got to see this guy. We've been torturing him for days, and he hasn't cried out. He doesn't even look upset. He doesn't." So the Shah came down the stairs and actually came into the entrance of the dungeon. And the way the family tells it is that he was in shackles. You know, the Shah looked around the corner into the room where he was being tortured, and Haji Akund saw him and said, "Your Majesty, I'm not going to hurt you. I can't move, let alone hurt you." And so then the Shah came around the corner and said, "Well, of course, I'm the Shah, and you're my subject." And then he ordered the guards to clean him up and put clothes on him and get that nice tapestry, put it behind him, and that camera thing that we've got from Europe, bring that down and take his picture. So there's a picture of Haji Akund. He looks like the king of the world. He's been tortured for days. It's a really incongruent picture when you see it. There's this tapestry behind him, and he's sitting there all dressed up, and then his hands and feet are in shackles. So it's it's hard to figure out what's going on in the picture. And his face is absolutely serene, not a care in the world. That is assurance. So I tell the story not to make it sound like some kind of miracle or something, but to say that that's why these people were called hands of the cause or apostles of Baha'u'llah, because that state of indwelling assurance of the loving, constant loving, generous presence of the Creator, who is always ready to answer, always ready to unfold his compassion, his grace, his mercy on us, always forgiving of everything, always embracing, always ready to answer our sincerest prayers. It wasn't a teaching to Haji Akund. He knew it. He lived in it. So that is our challenge. That is our challenge. In the Baha'i faith, there are all manner of ways in which we're invited to that state of being. There are prayers that Baha'is say every day that talk about this condition, that invite us to it. There's recitation of beautiful names of God that are ways that we can nurture that sense in ourselves. There's a fasting period. There's ways of living that Baha'u'llah prescribes. I highly recommend you get some of these writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and see for yourself how these amazing teachings from Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha can generate that sense within you. And what a gift that is when everything around us seems to be spinning out of control and people are more and more afraid and more angry and more put against each other. To have that sense of abiding assurance in a time like this, it's probably the greatest gift we could give our children, and the greatest gift we could bring to our marriages, the greatest gift we could bring to our work, to the way we raise our kids. So I thought I would stop there and then just see if we can have a conversation. So, all right, I apologize again for the technical glitches, but let's open it up and see if we can have a conversation.
So there are two questions for you online. And one, these are from Sue Emil, who you remember from Well Met.
Hi, Sue. Yeah.
So the first one is, what influenced you to become a psychiatrist? That's one. The second is, what prevents you from incorporating spirituality as a component for emotional, mental, physical, and psychosocial relational health into your practice? Why did you become a psychiatrist? Why can't you incorporate spirituality in your practice?
I see what you mean. Okay. Well, thanks for the question, Sue. What was the first one again?
Why did you become a psychiatrist?
It's why did I become a psychiatrist? Well, so Baha'is are very interested, are primarily interested in ushering in a new age for humanity. Baha'u'llah's amazing claim is that this is the promised day, and he is the promised one of all religions, which is a phenomenal claim. And so his teachings show us how we can move out of this chaos into something better, where we see each other finally as one human family, and that all of the struggles and conflicts and division of the time that we're in are all the result of prejudices and old ways of doing things that just don't work anymore. So he lays out a whole pattern, not only for individuals, but for families and communities and nations in the world, to establish what he calls the most great peace. So my thought was, so here I am in medical school. Let's say this is 40 years ago. Yeah, 40 years ago. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know, maybe I'll deliver babies. That would be wonderful. What could be better than that? I'm going to deliver babies. And I delivered a few, and I thought, oh my God, this is great. And but then I thought, I don't really do very well at 2 a.m. I probably shouldn't inflict myself on a woman at the most important time in her life at 2 a.m. because I'm not very good at 2 a.m. And then I was really good at surgery, and all the surgeons were saying, "Oh, you should be a surgeon." And I thought, and they always asked me to do all the little procedures. I was the guy when a medical student didn't want to do something. I thought, I'll do it. And so I thought, oh, maybe I'll be a surgeon. 2 a.m, surgeon. No, I thought, no, it doesn't pass the 2 a.m. test. I want to be asleep at 2 o'clock. I don't want to be awake at 2 o'clock. So no surgery. So I thought, well, I don't know, maybe a cardiologist. That's cool. And I thought, and then I went to this conference where this very, very famous lawyer by the name of Roger Fisher, it was a medical student conference. And here's this lawyer from Harvard talking about this new field called conflict resolution. Conflict resolution. I thought, boy, that's interesting. What's conflict? This was the 1980s, so nobody knew what conflict resolution was. So I thought, oh, that's what I want to do. I want to do conflict resolution because Baha'is want to build this peaceful world, and so to do that, we got to figure out how to solve conflicts. I want to do conflict resolution, but I'm in medical school. How do I get from medical school to conflict resolution? So long story short, I thought psychiatry. I'll be a psychiatrist because that'll give me a language and maybe insights into why people fight. And maybe there's a better way. Maybe there's like a language, a psychological language that could sort of help figure out how to create peace. So I became a psychiatrist because I was interested in international relations. Now, the funny thing about that is I promised myself as my psychiatric training, I would just stay as far away as I could from trauma and anything, because I thought I'm too sensitive. I'm not going to, I'm just, it's going to be too hard. I don't want to do that. Right. So you know how that story goes, right? So what's my career been about? Trauma. It's like all I do. But I couldn't be more grateful because it has been a great honor to see the nobility and the courage in the face of tremendous anguish and isolation and suffering, how people find nobility and they find these gems that we were talking about. Now, when I say I don't bring spirituality into I didn't think I said that. I think because I think every second of my practice is spiritual. There's a statement in the Baha'i teachings, or many statements in the Baha'i teachings that say that any service, any work done in the spirit of loving service is worship, right? Any service, making a piece of paper, cleaning the house, doesn't make any difference. Whatever is done with the fullness of your heart, with the sense of loving service, in the Baha'i faith, that's worship. So the thing is that in America, though, you just have to be careful about talking about doctrines because I have a position of power. And so to use my position of power to in any way even imply that I'm imposing a belief system on someone would be disrespectful. But leading people to this idea of assurance, that's common in all religions. That's the core of every religion. and there's plenty of psychological terms to. So that's how I kind of explain it.
John, I have a question. Kids and grandkids in the public school systems and things like that. I can't help but constantly think, I hope these kids are going to be okay. And, you know, they're going to somehow grow up to be good, solid citizens. What is it that one can do to help, in my case, grandchildren now? How do we keep them, protect them, if you will? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. This is the question. The generation of kids now have to do something that's never been done on the planet before. We talk about the greatest generation, you know, that lived during and fought the Second World War. This generation, my take is going to have to do some things at least as difficult. Save the planet, or change the trajectory of our degradation of the planet, find some way to avoid or to reject the racism and the sexism and the nationalism that are eating the vitals of humanity, and start us on a path of healing. My take is the kids that I know, none of them feels a connection to the biases and prejudices that I grew up with. So that's very, very encouraging. What I find disheartening is like this young girl I was talking about the other day, or earlier in the talk, the sense of despair and the sense of, is this a world worth living in? Right? That's a big question. So how does then one inculcate that with a child? Well, the place to start is families and neighborhoods, you know, or intimate circles of people. You know, that I saw this sign today in my clinic. I didn't put it there, but it says, you know, they say it takes a village to raise a child, but nobody tells us how to find the village. Right? How do you make it? We got to make villages. We have to make contexts within which kids can have the experience of assurance, right? So that in their own despair or in their own challenges in life, they know where to go. They have, you know, nothing like a grandmother's love. There's nothing like a grandfather's love or a parent's love, right? But that has to be accelerated and has to be widened and given more language and more, there have to be more paths to that, to our children's lives, where it's not just going to all the soccer games and it's not just, you know, having the latest phone, but our children need to become adept at finding their own assurance, and it has to become a value in the family, not where we pray together, let's say, so that we are beseeching God for a gift, you know, give me that bike, you know, but to like Howard Colby Ives, to know how to get access to the Creator, right? So that we have access to transformative spirit in our lives. There's a critical question or critical insight in the Baha'i writings that emerges the more you read them, is that this idea about gems that I talked about, that Baha'u'llah says that regard man as a mind rich in gems. Well, if you think about it, think of that metaphor, that a gem, you could be standing on the side of a mountain and not realize that right beneath your feet are rubies and emeralds and diamonds and gold. So first you have to know there are gems there, right? So you have to know that you contain the universe, you contain the signs of God, you contain all the names and attributes and qualities of the Creator. They're all within each of us. You know? So first you have to know that. And at first it's an intellectual thing, but then over time, once you see interchanges with people where there is an elevated discourse, an elevated conversation, where those things are valued, where they're pointed out, where they're encouraged, then the child starts to feel like this is not just a belief system, but it's a reality. So to make a long answer, but I'm hoping I'm being clear that finding ways to nurture a sense of assurance is the single most important thing we can do for a child. And my take is it's almost impossible to do. Well, maybe that's too strong to say. I think it's the power of that experience is magnified exponentially when that sense of assurance is something cultivated within a community. So, and by the way, that leads to really a phenomenal, maybe even an historic global initiative. The Baha'i started some 25 years ago, maybe, to organize very, very locally within homes and neighborhoods to elevate the discourse in this way, to try to, and to focus, on helping families raise their kids with this kind of assurance, with these kinds of sensibilities, and of serving others. And we've got our work cut out for us because there's so many distractions and so many ways in which this culture works in the opposite direction. You guys have plenty of experience in that. I don't want to, take up all of our time on that, but that's a good context, I think. For
here's a question. Data shows that humankind has improved its condition in so many ways, so many respects, standards of living, warmongering, etc. And yet you observe the times are so bad nowadays, like so many exploding eggs, I guess. Does this mean we are less resilient now than the previous generations were? Or are we more attuned to the sufferings of those around us?
It's kind of a mixture, isn't it? It's Abdul Baha, again, back to his visit to this country in New York City, which, was growing to be the world metropolis. It is now, but it was emerging as that. And Abdul Baha praised the material civilization of the West. And he made these comments all over in Europe and in the United States and in New York in particular. And but he said, if this could be combined with divine civilization, the progress humanity would make would be beyond comprehension. So he talked about a material civilization and a divine civilization. And my understanding of what he was talking about has some roots in what we just said, that it's, a change in value and experience in the culture that puts this bringing out of human potential as the goal, not the acquisition of anything. Not that there shouldn't be acquisition, but that the goal should be the bringing out of human capacity and human potential, and the nurturing of human potential in each other, right? Because of a deep and abiding understanding of our common humanity. So we live in this ironic state, don't we, in which on the one hand, we can be made aware of the state of people suffering from a hurricane, in Southern California and Mexico, or an earthquake in Indonesia. We can know it instantly. But what is done with that information on the media is it's sensationalized to make us watch more so they can sell stuff to us. Right. So even our suffering is commodified. It's turned into a commodity to sell us stuff. Whole news networks perpetuate garbage just to keep people angry so that they can sell expensive advertising time. Right. And they even say that's what they're doing. Right. So we are progressively weakening our capacity to find that assurance, that spiritual core. And we've, like this young lady I was describing earlier, 18 years old, 17 years old, and doesn't have a clue that she has a skill or that there's any gem in her at all. But what she does see is a scary world that is painted as a fearful place, a place to be angry, a place to be blaming one group of people over another. And that whatever you are, it's not enough because you need to buy this and you don't have one of these. And how come you don't have the latest one of these? So you're always being told you're not enough. And so you are never seen, right? You are not seen because you are a consumer. You are not a divine being that holds within you the universe. Right? So we have a work cut out for us. And if there were a priority in efforts, I think it would be what the Baha'is figured out. It would be working in, close circles of neighbors and friends to elevate the discourse, to value these things, at least in that circle, and then and with children, and kind of work through what this means, because it's not going to be a recipe. It's going to wind up being a struggle where people apply a principle and make a mess of it, and then learn from it, and then try again another way, and then having a community of people who's forgiving and compassionate enough to kind of stick with the process. So we have to be about building something better. And if kids see that, like this young woman I was telling you about, if there's an example in their life that they can point to and say, well, that works, I like that, or that seems to be ennobling. Sometimes that's all a kid needs to know, right? That there's a grandpa, or there's a neighbor, there's a teacher, a coach, or a group of people who are valuing this elevated appreciation of human nature. That's enough to give them hope to live.
The question is, for the next 9 years at least, our guidance as Baha'is encourages us to focus on social justice issues like the environment, public health, and the arts. How would you say they are interrelated, and what approaches would you recommend?
Boy, the environment, human rights, and social justice.
The environment,
What did
health, public health, and the arts.
Yeah. Well, at this notion of oneness, I've talked before about the idea that we don't understand unity, really. Even Baha'is who have spent, like me, I've been a Baha'i 50-some years, and I don't really know that I know what unity looks like. I mean, I've seen it a few times, and I've experienced it in certain levels, but humanity has really never seen global unity. It has never existed. So we have to figure it out. We have to experiment. We have to look to our indigenous brothers and sisters who grew up culturally, never doubting that every breath they took was connected to the life of everything else on the planet. So that sensibility is really at the core of our spirituality, because it with a sense of our connection to the environment, our intimate connection, not just that it's an issue that we need to tend to, but that our life is intimately and intricately involved with all other life. That is a foundational principle of a spiritual life. So I think on one level, the House of Justice, the Baha'i international governing body, is telling us to we need to be thinking more about how it's not just that we're a principle we believe in, that we're one as a human family, but that what does that mean? What's the lived experience of being one family united with a planet that we are a part of, right? That we are one system of a living system called the Earth, you know, in a universe of living, breathing creation. So I see that as it has not only are we being called to environmental action, which I think the House of Justice is asking us to do, but they're also asking us to challenge the assumptions we have about the nature of our humanity and the nature of our responsibility to life, all life, and the implications of the oneness of humanity at this very organic level. So this is the House of Justice pointing a united international community now towards healing the planet, right? And there's a wonderful statement of Shoghi Effendi, who's the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, the grandson of Abdul Baha. He said that man, meaning humanity, is organic with the planet, and that what affects one affects the other. We are intimately engaged in the other, that you can't separate the two. So as humanity explores the meaning of this idea of unity, the planet will respond. And as the planet responds, it'll have a redounding effect on human consciousness and back and forth. So this dynamic is what's needed for the next maybe several hundred years to fix the planet, right? So the House is directing us that way. Now, the second is in the realm of social, the way we are with each other. The reason we need to be engaged in social justice is because when you think that your race, let's say, is better than any others, or let's say your people has suffered more than anyone, or there's been a war and your side suffered, and whenever we have suffering, it has the potential of shrinking and solidifying our sense of who we are, our sense of identity. A friend of mine at Harvard called this the narcissism of suffering, that since we suffered so much in that war, no one's ever suffered like us, and now we're special, and that we have a right now to get justice on those other people. So the notion of justice gets distorted when human suffering isn't linked with our spiritual nature, because we allow the suffering to turn us into tribes, right? And then the tribes fight each other. So what's needed is a global ethic where we see, again, how we are tied with all life, so that we have a standard of justice that includes everyone, right? Not just what's fair for me, but what's also fair for people that I don't know, or who might be seen and defined as being on another side. How do we establish justice when there are no sides, when we're all in this together? So I see this as the House of Justice saying, again, that idea of Shoghi Effendi, that man is organic with the world, right? That if we are to solve the planet's issues, we must also simultaneously establish justice amongst people, right? So that we're united amongst ourselves. So this notion of social justice and environmental salvation are linked in that way. Now, and then the third issue is with the arts. The whole process of human growth, as Baha'u'llah explains, is the bringing out of these divine gems, right? They lie potential within us. And it's our purpose in life to bring them out, to express them as loving kindness, as selfless service to others, as deepened prayer and search for wisdom. This bringing out of these gems is fundamentally a creative process. And you could say, there's this notion that you hear in some circles about co-creation, that humanity and God are co-creating. Baha'is would agree with that, I think, that that there is a nature within us that God intends in this promised day to bring out in its fullest. That this is the age when all of the potentialities that God has invested in humanity, this is the age in which they will all be brought out. Well, that's a creative process. You know, the ancient Greeks, Athena was the goddess of war or destruction and culture. Right? So they had this notion that there's a connection between when things fall apart and creating something new. So Baha'i, and not that we believe in Athena, but that idea I think is very powerful, that in the time we're in of great crisis and calamity that could get worse, that there is a creative potential in it, that there's a falling away of old ways that are killing us and the planet. And there's now this potential, this space for something to be created anew, right? And so I see that as fundamentally art and culture. So the House of Justice is saying now, within this context of trying to solve problems between the way the earth and humanity are getting along, right, in terms of environmental protection and social justice, that the arts are the efflorescence, they're the beauty of human nature. It's that this process should be beautiful. This process should be, it's like a forest is beautiful. It doesn't have to try. It just is, right? You see a beautiful stream or a waterfall, it's beautiful. You don't have to make it different. It's already beautiful. So that this process of uniting the planet, uniting humanity with itself and with the planet and healing both is a creative and necessarily artistic process. So I think this is a triad that the House of Justice is asking us to think about.
There's a question here that says, with the current studies of epigenetics and theories about healing ancestral trauma, are you interested in the effect of trauma on our DNA? And then it says that this lady had attended something with class with other Baha'is who are descended from martyrs of the faith. And she keeps thinking about possible layers of trauma.
Hugely important question. First of all, just sort of a recitation of the state of affairs. I've often said that if sexual abuse of girls in particular, the boys are abused sexually also, but if the sexual abuse of children did not exist, I wouldn't have a job. Right? Sexual abuse of children is far more prevalent than we'd like to think, and it's devastating on the individual who is victimized that way, as well as the family in which it occurs and the perpetrator. It is utterly corrupting for the perpetrator, but it sets in motion a series of devastating encumbrances on the lives of its victims. And if that issue alone, along with substance abuse, if those two things could be stopped, the world, I think, would change the next day. Hugely important issues, and gets to the core of some of the things we're talking about the nobility of human nature and the way the genders relate to each other and value each other and see each other. That's going to be at the very heart of the global transformation, is how, not only how the races see each other, but how men and women see each other, right? Abdul Baha talks about men and women being like the two wings of a bird, that the bird can't fly unless both are strong. So, so this topic of sexual abuse of children is, I think, critically important. Now, in terms of trauma that is transgenerational, a critically important issue. My sense is that we don't really get suffering very well in this culture. We don't understand it. Years ago, I was in Haifa, where the Baha'i World Center is, and I had the wonderful gift of Mr. or Dr. Rue, who was on the Universal House of Justice. He invited me to dinner, and I was so excited. And I went in the Pilgrim House there, and there was Mr. Nakjavani, who's and I was just so amazed to see him. And he said, "Oh, Dr. Woodall, it's so good to see you. What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'm going to the Ruse. I was invited to dinner." And Mr. Nakjavani took a step back, and he said, Dr. Rue, there is a man who has successfully. Whoa, I suffered successfully. And my head started spinning. I'm thinking, suffered successfully? I don't want to suffer at all. So, and I don't want, what are you talking about suffering for? Where I'm on pilgrimage. So I didn't want to hear anything about suffering. So I think we have this notion that if we're living correctly, somehow the world will not try to harm us, or that we won't be wounded by life. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more of how do we cultivate over time our own Haji Akund, right? So we're not guaranteed a pain-free life. We're given guidance on how to protect the divine gift within us and how to nurture it, so that we find our own way of being Haji Akund and being assured. I'm way off the question. I think I lost the question in there somehow.
Epigenetics.
Oh, and then epigenetics. So what I was trying to get to, and I apologize, was that our culture convinces people that if you're suffering, there's something wrong with you. That if you're unhappy, or if you're struggling with large questions about the value and meaning of life, you probably don't have enough. You're probably not buying the right things on Spotify, and you're probably not watching enough TikTok, and so it immediately commodifies that, and someone's going to teach you a course online for $299, right? So it's like our suffering is commodified instantly, and so there's no notion of the value of what would it look like to successfully suffer, right? What would that look like? So in the sense of trauma, I think this then gets passed from generation to generation, unfiltered. The suffering wasn't allowed to bring out wisdom and compassion. Instead, it's iconified. It's turned into an icon. It's turned into a hero, turned into someone who we are to admire, right? And in a way, it's a kind of a hagiography where we're like making heroes out of people, so we can say we got better heroes than that religion, or we've got right, and not to put that down, but because we need heroes, but that the sense of that these are all pointing to my transformation. How can I turn that suffering into my transformation? How can I help someone in their transformation? So I think transgenerational trauma is real because we live in a culture that doesn't point us to successful suffering. So my take is for us to unite this planet, we better get that down, because we're going to suffer a lot. It's just happened in Florida with the hurricane. So people are suffering tonight, right? And so are we helping people to learn compassion and unity and our connection to all things in the midst of this suffering, while we're necessarily helping them with housing and food and things? So I would just point back to this process that the House of Justice set up with these core activities. It's just a very rough framework of what could be a dynamic process at a local level where people are really seeing each other, right? The good, the bad, the struggle, the pain, the anguish, and the successful elements of suffering that we're all capable of. One last thing on that, and then I'm going to be quiet on it. Most of what makes me, I was asked why did I become a psychiatrist, and I gave an answer to that, but I didn't say why I stayed a psychiatrist. And I've stayed a psychiatrist because of the incredible honor it is to witness someone who struggles alone, without any support, perhaps with great antagonism directed towards them or hostility over the course of years and decades, where there's no guarantee of an answer or relief. And yet people find the courage and the honesty to struggle in such situations and find beauty and to find grace and to find a way to be compassionate and caring and to let go of parts of themselves that are traumatized enough to have them transformed into that successful suffering that brings out those gems. That's why I stayed a psychiatrist. And every day I have the great bounty, the great honor and privilege of witnessing that in my patients.
Janet Chimino asks, how can we engender that sense of assurance in children? What does that process look like? Okay, so here's my Gandhi story. So this guy, Janet, you might have heard this. I might have said this in your home. So Gandhi was, this is a true story. Gandhi was approached by this man who wanted to quit smoking. And he said to Gandhi, Bapu, this is a filthy habit. I want to stop. I can't stop. My wife wants me to stop. My kids want me to, I just can't stop. Every time I try to get sick and I tremble and I break down and I start smoking again. Can you teach me how to stop smoking? And Gandhi looked at him and said, yeah, I can teach you how to stop smoking, but you have to come back in a month. And the guy said, well, can you teach me now? And the Gandhi said, no, you got to come back in a month. And I promise you, I'll teach you how to quit smoking. So the man went off, and 30 days later, he comes back and he says, Bapu, it's been 30 days. I'm still smoking. I really need your help. Can you teach me how to stop smoking now? And Gandhi says, yes, I can. And the man said, well, why didn't you teach me 30 days ago? And Gandhi said, I had to quit smoking. So that's how I feel with that. How do we teach assurance? I think the answer is we struggle to find it. Ideally we become it, right? And the irony is that at the moments when we're the most selfless and assured, we're not even aware of it because we're being selfless, so we're not aware of it. Probably that 30,000th time you changed the diaper at 2 a.m. and got the vomit off of you, to go to work. It's probably some assurance going on in there. Right. And so there's probably a lot of more assurance going on than we give ourselves credit for. But I think it's mostly modeling. So showing a child, not that you are assured, but that you're moving towards it and maybe sharing at a level that's appropriate for the child, your struggle that I'm right now, I just really am angry, but I'm really afraid because this happened, but I'm going to say some prayers and I'm going to get calm and I'm going to see if I can get a new perspective. That's how it's in the million things that happen every day where our kids are watching us, right? And so it's not a teaching so much. I mean, it is, but the teaching is our struggling. And then again, that gets back to community, where that the sharing at the level of these core activities, for instance. Can you imagine what it would be like if, and reading these wonderful lessons that are compiled in these core activities that the Baha'is do, if it was accompanied by that kind of sharing? And I think in Baha'i communities that are going there, and talking about as parents, this question, how do you demonstrate assurance to your kids? And maybe there's some kids in the group while you're talking about it. That's the modeling. It's the modeling. Anybody else have any question? John, just to tell you, there's about 20 people on YouTube, and some of them are all gathered in one room, bunch of them watching. So you can't see them, but there's a whole bunch of them on YouTube, apparently.
Okay, well, thanks for hanging out. Is there some way we can get any of their questions, or?
Well, Janet Chimino's question, she sent out on YouTube. So she's not, she doesn't want to show up and on Zoom, but she's on YouTube.
Okay, all right. Janet, I look forward to seeing you again. Love to the family.
Anybody else have any questions or comments or thoughts? This has been a wonderful, in spite of all the technical issues, this has been a wonderful presentation, John. I have really enjoyed it. Glad to finally see Jerry after so many years.
Yeah, Gary's my hero.
Jerry was my hero. Yes, I roomed, you know, Jerry and I roomed together for about
I
a year
know,
and a half.
I know, I remember.
Me, Ivor, and Jerry. That was the three stooges there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some
Oh, that's
some of the
hilarious.
comments from your older brother were funny about us three
Oh,
rooming together.
So I'm sure that's true. Yeah.
John, it's delightful to see you. What a great talk, and I truly
Oh.
wish we didn't have it. It worked out quite well in spite of the technical issues. And
Yeah,
we had
again,
this.
and it's all on me.
No, don't worry about it. We have it all on YouTube, and so it's recorded permanently for people to watch on an ongoing basis, those that were not able to be here. So can't thank you enough, John, for agreeing to do this. This was so wonderful. We needed this. We all needed this.
Oh, well, it's so great to hear your voice, Ajit. Isn't it something? It's like 40 years since I've seen you or something. It feels like a couple days ago.
No, Jerry. I said, John, I saw you at the Austin conference when you came here.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's right. Oh my God, that was 10 years ago, wasn't it?
Blue Bonnet, it was 10 years ago.
That
Okay.
was the first time I met your wife too that day.
Oh, right. Yeah. Wow. Boy, we both lived about 10 lifetimes since then.
Before that, I saw you at the garden teaching and we met.
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. Remember, that's ancient history. That was a lot of fun though, wasn't it?
It was fun. It was fun. So
Yeah.
thank you,
Yeah.
John.
A couple of
All right.
shout outs that you have, John, is there's a YouTube viewer, SL initials, that said beautiful, appreciate greatly this presentation. And then the group gathered in San Marcos, Texas. They're at the home of someone and watching you on YouTube on a TV, and they're waving at you and saying hi. And my daughter says she appreciates your advice as a member of the younger generation herself.
Oh, listen, I want to get out of the way and let your daughter and all the kids, get on the world stage, because they're going to fix it.
John, it was delightful, really delightful. And it was great to see you again.
All right. I love all of you. All right. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And all right, let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. All righty. Take care, you guys. Thank you so much.
Aloha pa.
Bye-bye now.